Hi, my name's Ellie. Thanks for joining me today. I have a question for you and I nearly turned it into the title for today's video. You'll probably realize why I didn't in a moment. My question is, do you matter? Do you matter to the world? Do you matter to the people around you? Or do you feel as though you always have to perform in some way? You always have to be perfect? Or perhaps you're on the other side of the spectrum and you've kind of gotten to the point where you don't try anymore. You don't care anymore. Perhaps you even welcome the fact that you might feel a bit unseen because when you were younger, you were getting the wrong kind of attention. You're in the background. You're the person who is always good, or you're the caregiver, or you're just plain invisible unless it's an advertiser who wants your money. Because, as it happens, the advertisers have figured out that the most powerful consumer is the woman over 40. So you're definitely seen by advertisers. But what about in other parts of your life? This is something that is kind of ingrained into women, and it puts us in a position where being ourselves is discouraged. This is something that starts small for women, but it becomes a bigger and bigger issue as they travel through life. And the important thing is to identify it and understand it for what it is, because then we can get beyond it regardless of our age. So this concept of not being seen and sometimes being treated like we don't matter, it falls within the archetypal system. And it's one of three archetypes. The first of these is the good girl archetype. The good girl archetype is one where it's very important to other people that you be a pleasing person, that you don't rock the boat, that you don't make anyone feel uncomfortable. Because if you do anything outside of the archetypal expectations, then other people might feel discomfort, which then they project onto you as being selfish. Isn't that weird? When in fact, the selfishness is from expecting someone to not be themselves so that you can remain comfortable. Can you see how it's been flipped around? That's the good girl archetype, feeling as though you have to suppress or repress yourself in order to cater to somebody else's comfort or their expectation of what should please them in you. The second of these three archetypes is the caregiver. And the caregiver is the person who just puts everybody else's needs first, and definitely ahead of her own. The mother and wife who has been busy and crazy chasing all of the dreams and requirements and all of the after school activities and the cooking and the cleaning and the shopping and the catering to the desires and the life affirming activities of the partner or husband and children almost her entire life. It sits within the good girl archetype, but it can also be an archetype of its own. This carries on to women who have aging parents as well. They then transitioned from being the proxy for children and partner to proxy for parent, to make sure that somebody else's needs are being taken care of. So that is archetype number 2. Archetype number 3 is just the invisible one. And this tends to happen to women once they kind of switch over into 40 something. But it happens increasingly as women age. There's this common view that it's beauty-based. Society still has this expectation that women really only exist when they are very young and very beautiful with soft, supple, young skin and line-free faces. That is basically what beauty is all about and what femininity is all about and what being a woman is all about. Once you start to age out of that expectation, visual expectation, then the beauty-based attention starts to wane because you're considered in the general scheme of things as being not quite as attractive to men, which is interesting because that means that your worth and whether or not you can even be seen by society is based on the perception of the other gender rather than your own. Very peculiar, but it does happen. And regardless of how evolved the world gets, it is still a real issue for women. Now, there are many women who get to a certain age and they say, I'm so glad that I'm not getting that negative, gawking attention from men anymore. But it's not just about being gawked at. And it also affects other things like looking for a job, for example, or getting served in a cafe or at a bar, or being taken seriously in discussions. Women who are 40 plus, particularly if they're reaching 50 and plus and in the workplace, are often overlooked when it comes to things like promotion. They may be kind of corralled into a support role or as someone who is a really good coordinator because they've gathered a lot of experience, so they're really good at being able to take a back seat to someone else. I have actually experienced this in jobs over the years where I have a really amazing work ethic. I'm not going to lie. I think anyone who's been watching me for a minute knows that I can't help myself. I am just very driven when it comes to, not when it comes to ambition or success or anything like that. I'm just very driven to always be productive. And so when I have a job, I tend to work very hard. And I tend to be the one who very quickly gets to know everything about what I'm working on because I can't help myself. I'm just interested and I want to kind of, I don't know, do my best or something. And what happens is often I have been spotted by someone who is far more ambitious and they have somehow been able to turn me into their second in command because that way I get to do all the work and they get to take all the glory. I'm going to tell you this actually happened to me because I'm afraid I don't fit the stereotype of the good girl or the caregiver or the invisible one very comfortably. I tend to rebel and I'm always in trouble about that. But there was this occasion where we actually had a national event. It didn't have outside people. It was an internal national event, kind of like a get together to discuss, I don't know, whatever the key things were that all the employees had to know. And I was the only person in the building at the time who had a really comprehensive understanding of everything to do with the subject that we were working on as a team. And my boss, who happened to be a very highly paid consultant, he wasn't an employee like me. He was hired out. I think he was making something like, if I remember correctly, at least triple what I was making, if you think of it on an hourly basis, at least triple. Because I do remember seeing what he was being paid, and I nearly fell off my chair when I did. But it was at least triple, and it could have even been quadruple my pay, something like that. It was ridiculous. And he somehow got into this accidental situation where the boss, the super boss, asked him to demonstrate something on a whiteboard that he was leading on. And do you know what? He couldn't even begin to explain what it was. And I sat there very quietly and I was watching and I thought to myself, should I help him? Should I help him? Should I help him? And I have to be honest, I didn't help him for about 5-8 minutes. And then I thought, no, okay, I'll get up. And I got up and I explained the whole thing on the whiteboard. I didn't know which was worse, sitting there and letting him suffer or getting up and showcasing the fact that he's getting paid to do nothing while I'm doing everything. Anyway, that was just one example. And I know that women experience this a lot, which is the reason why I mentioned it. This kind of thing, these archetypes are affecting women all over their lifespan. But you know, even for me in this world of social media, I'm nearly 60. I'm going to be 60 next year. What a milestone. And I have a wealth of experience in life. I do. I've experienced all kinds of things in all parts of the world. And I'm also a really good researcher. So anything I haven't personally encountered, if I have an interest in it, I'm going to go and find information about it. But I'm not 20-something anymore, and I don't look like a 20-something-year-old. I'm certainly not a supermodel-y kind of looking person, and I don't have a slick wardrobe, although, you know, I do love my T-shirts, and I've got lots of those. And I've been told to shut up quite a few times here on social media, which I think probably is one of the reasons why I decided not to. So thank you to whoever it was that started off that kind of commenting, because I am obviously a bit of a rebel and it kind of set a fire under me. But I obviously am not going to fit that category of being a really young, kind of smooth-faced, gorgeous, supermodel, kind of perfect person who's carefully curated and the ideal image for this, world that we live in. There might be more depth coming from me, but I'm still going to have to work very, very hard to be seen. And so it affects every aspect of life. And that wouldn't just be for me. That would be for everyone who is kind of like me, who is a woman who is no longer fitting that perfect image. So we're going to look at one of these archetypes more closely because it really is the foundational one that can lead to the others, or which the others kind of appear in, and that is the good girl archetype. It can appear in your family dynamics. So as a child, you may have been the kind of little girl who smoothed over the family conflicts. If there was fighting, you would do something to kind of make everything calm down, and it might even be at your own expense. This is something that may have carried over into your adulthood, where you still feel pressure to be the dutiful daughter, for example, or the perfect mother, or the selfless partner, or even the devoted carer. It's about saying yes to the demands of other people, even when you are really tired or are having trouble figuring out how you're going to fit it in. Because good girls don't disappoint other people. They just don't let people down. And so this may have been something that's been drummed into you through the family dynamic. But it also happens in the workplace. In compensation in the workplace, when you are kind of in a disadvantaged position, there is a likelihood that the woman will over-deliver. And I think that in a way is something that I probably have done in the past, which is the reason why I still retain that really strong work ethic. You kind of feel as though you have to do more or prove more to be able to satisfy everyone's expectations that you are worthy of being there. And then you may even hesitate asking for recognition in compensation for that, or a promotion, or even fair pay, despite the fact that it's kind of legal and a requirement under law. The default here is that women tend to, and increasingly as they get older, with very few exceptions, get pushed into reliable background support roles. Like I had mentioned earlier, rather than being the visible leader who kind of is the face of the success story, it's kind of the women behind the success, the background support that really technically made it all happen, but don't quite get the same allocate. And this is often because we've been conditioned as women to value harmony around us rather than our own visibility. But there are other ways that the good girl archetype can appear in your life, and one of those is in your friendships and your social circles. If you've been in a group where you're always the peacekeeper, someone who's always trying not to rock the boat, you've got big personalities in the group, but you are the one who is always kind of in the background. You're there, but you're not really being seen. You might also be the one who's always doing everyone else favors, or you're always the shoulder to lean on during a crisis. But it's not necessarily returned because you are considered to be the reliable backbone of the group, who's always great, always in a good spirit, always positive, always supportive, and never needy. How's that even possible? But sometimes that's just the way it is. Friendship and social dynamics are the same as your family dynamic and your work dynamic. They also can experience these kinds of strange archetypal behaviors. You might end up avoiding things like setting boundaries, because when you set boundaries, you feel as though you're being selfish or you're being unkind towards the other person. And you may even be in a group of close friends, but still you don't feel comfortable about being able to share some of your really big success stories, because you don't want other people to feel as though they haven't quite reached the same level of success. The good girl archetype can twist things around for you. Being humble doesn't prevent you from being talented or creative or skilled or highly intelligent or really successful. Being humble is really about understanding where it sits in society. And humility is about recognizing that you have good qualities or really admirable qualities, including things like success or intelligence or a special gift. But thinking of it in terms of how you can share it with others, not by showing off, but by sharing your gifts with people in a way that can help to soothe and heal the world and do your bit to make the world a better place. Humility is different to invisibility. Invisibility is when you try and pretend you don't have those things because you're afraid that if you show that you have a talent or a skill or that you're very intelligent or that you have some kind of special element in you that is a good trait to have, that other people are going to resent you for it. And then there's the spiritual aspect of feeling guilty about the fact that you might want more from life. You might want more freedom, or you might want a bigger voice, or you might want more presence in the world, because wanting more kind of clashes with this voice that says, no, you have to be a good girl. These three archetypes, whether it be the good girl, the caregiver, or the invisible one, when they are in play, they're kind of under the umbrella of being the I don't matter archetypes. At least that's the label that I put on it, because it's where we're saying to ourselves, or where it's been ingrained into our psyche, that we don't matter as much as whoever else it is that's out there. And that's when you know that the archetype is running the show. By being wrapped up in someone else's life and the needs of other people, when they leave, their joy leaves. And that means everything you've been working towards is gone. And that is the empty nest syndrome at its worst. And I think that it breeds something, and this is the thing that people don't really talk about at all. You start feeling very invisible because all of the things that you thought were yours actually belong to someone else, and you are left without all of that. The investment that you've made in dreams and creativity and expression and desires and wants were actually investments that belong to other people. It's like buying a house and putting it in someone else's name, which means they can change the locks on you any day they like, and then suddenly you have nowhere to live. It's the same kind of feeling. What this does, and this is the kicker, is it breeds resentment. And this resentment is something that often crops up in later life because of all the things that you've missed, not even realizing that you've missed them until suddenly they're all gone. I actually know a woman who is in her late 80s right now, and she was a war child. She was the firstborn in the family, and her entire childhood was sacrificed because when her family left their home country in the middle of the war, they obviously were very poor. They came to Australia, and as the firstborn, I think she was around about 5 or 6 or something years older than the next child. She had to grow up really, really quickly, and so her sacrifice was that her childhood basically was gone. When they moved to Australia, she quit school really young to be able to help keep the family going. All of her pay would go into the family dynamic to pay for groceries and I don't know whether it was rent or mortgage or whatever it was at the time, and just to have the family survive and to support the younger children. And then she married young because she'd already grown when she was really young. So she ended up marrying really young. I think she was something like 16 or 17 when she got married, really young, and became a mother really young as well. And her husband was a very demanding character. So she spent a lot of her youth catering to the children that she had, which were quite a few children. And so it was a kind of a big household. And also her husband as well, who was very demanding. They were all very, very demanding, the entire family. She spent her time as the breeder and the cleaner and the therapist for everyone else in the family. And then her husband died. And ultimately her children left home and started their own families. And then she ended up being her parents' caregiver as well. So her entire life was about other people ever since she was a child. And then suddenly when her parents died and her kids were living in other parts of the country, Suddenly she was by herself and she was late in life and she suddenly had time to reflect. And all of the things that she could have done for herself had instead been done for other people. But then eventually those people move on and she was left alone. And I do know, I don't see her personally hardly at all, because she actually is a friend of someone that I know. But I do hear the stories about her. And I often hear this phrase coming from the person that I know that says, I don't know where all this resentment came from. Because whenever she talks to this woman, the woman is full of resentment for her family and for her parents and for her life and for squabbles that happened 30 years ago with neighbors or friends or whatever. She has so much to be resentful for. And the person that I know is often saying, I just don't know where this resentment came from. And as I'm listening to the stories, I'm thinking very quietly to myself, I know exactly where that resentment came from. She was embodying the archetypes of the good girl, the caregiver, and the invisible one. She lived a life where the key message was that she didn't matter. At least not as much as everyone else did. And she has the right to be resentful. I'm not saying that she should be resentful, but I think it's a valid feeling. And the funny thing is, she is still giving care to someone else. Life, it's a bit like the oxygen mask rule that you get in airplanes. You really can't help other people until you've helped yourself. And that's not selfishness. That's essential when it comes to life. There are two really important things to remember when it comes to these archetypes that women often fall into. Number one is these archetypes are not your enemy. They were probably necessary, and they were necessary for survival at some point in your life. But that doesn't mean that they're necessary now. You may have needed them then, but ask yourself, do you need them now? And the second thing is, these archetypes are a state of mind. That's what they are. They're a state of mind that shape us into who we are. And that means all you have to do is flick a switch. It's never too late to shift your perspective, even just a little bit, in order to improve your future. So how exactly do we flick the switch? So the most obvious thing is to recognize when these archetypes are speaking to us. Are you critical? Are you not doing enough for other people? These little voices are telling you that there might be an archetype at play, sending you these messages. Do you have the urge to come second to someone else, or to shrink away from the view of others? Do you feel needy? Or are you being treated like you're needy? When you live off the energy of other people's lives, then you feel the need to always be in that energy in order to survive. You can help to prompt your identification of thoughts that are holding you back through this archetypal system by asking yourself really pointed questions and then answering those questions. So one question might be, where in my life am I still asking for permission to be myself? Do you have to hold back with the family? Do you have to hold back with your friends? Do you have to hold back at work? Because if you can identify what aspect of life that's in, then you are one step towards being able to see where the archetype is playing. And once you see it, then you can get beyond it by making those little changes about how you interact in that environment. Or maybe you could create a set of mantras, or even just one mantra that helps to remind you that you matter. This is something that I remembered this when I was researching for today's show and getting my episode notes together. I remembered something that I used to do years ago. When I worked in policing, policing is a really male-dominated environment. And if you are a female police officer, you're going to feel it. But I wasn't a police officer. I was a policy advisor, which means I'm definitely not as good as a male police officer in the eyes of, policing. And I'm not as good as a female police officer. And so as a civilian employee in the police service, you kind of are considered to be down a rung. And if you are a female one, then you're down another rung, because there's a lot of retired male police officers who go into the civilian roles. And so you're kind of a fourth class citizen. And Even if you are a policy advisor and people are kind of listening to the things you have to say. Well, I, as a policy advisor and also as a scribe, because I used to write strategic manuals, I would often be sitting in very high-powered police leadership meetings, because there'd be people like politicians and political activists and commissioners of police or chiefs of police for the various different countries or counties. And I would, be participating in discussion, probably not as much as some of them, but I would be, because there may need to be clarifying points and things like that. And I was often surrounded by massive egos, because it doesn't matter what sector you're working in. Once people get to the top, the egos tend to rise, Sometimes on my way to the meeting, or as I was getting dressed in the morning or something, I would be reciting to myself little things like, I belong in every room that I enter, because sometimes you'd walk into a room and you'd see all this power and you'd think, do I belong here? And yeah, I do. It's my job to be there. And I have to get the best out of it as well. And they have to get the best out of me. So I do belong in every room that I walk into. That was my mantra. But it could be anything, whatever it is that suits you. Try one of these, for example. You could say, my presence matters here, or I have the right to be heard, or I don't need permission to be myself, or what I have to bring has value, or it's time for me to live my own story instead of the story of other people. Archetypes only have power over us when we can't really see them working. But once we actually go in there and examine and realize that we have kind of fallen into an archetype, then it starts to loosen its grip and we're able to live beyond it. Just think of Dorothy when it came to the wizard on The Wizard of Oz. This wizard was so scary when she wasn't able to see what was behind the curtain. But when Dorothy got to see that the wizard was actually this, I think he was a little stout little bald guy who was just pulling some levers behind the curtain, suddenly he just wasn't so scary anymore, and he wasn't able to control her anymore. This is the same thing when it comes to archetypes. The messages of being a good girl or the caregiver or the others, or the expectation that we put ourselves last, or put up with being invisible. These tricks that corral us into this archetypal kind of system, they stop working as soon as we see them for what they are. So do a little exercise and think about this. And you know what? Feel free to comment as well if you feel that you can. Go back in time to the family. Go back in time to memories of work, or even some of the social groups that you've been part of and the friendship groups, and see if you can identify who was the good girl in that group, who was the caregiver, who was the caregiver in that group, and who was the invisible one in that group. Because I bet in most dynamics, especially where women are there, you'll see evidence of those archetypes at play. And if it was you who was any of those things, do you still need that archetype in your life? Or are you ready to break free and just be yourself? Because you are perfect just as you are. You are enough. You don't need an archetype hanging off your neck. Just be you. Welcome to the new world. This is Ellie Dreams Down Under. I love knowing you're here, and I'll see you in my dreams.